Hey guys, Mr. Milton here. Today we're going to talk about solving absolute value equations. At the end of this video, you'll be able to set up both equations to find the solutions to an absolute value equation. I want to remind you that absolute value is a number's distance from zero. Remember that when we talk about distance, we will never have a negative distance, okay? You'll never run negative 2 miles. If you run 2 miles, you run 2 miles, no matter the direction, okay? So distance is always positive. An absolute value equation is an equation that has a variable inside the absolute value bars. Okay, for example, our first example is absolute value of x equals 5, but I'd like you to know that x equals the absolute value of 5 is not an absolute value equation because the x is not inside of the absolute value bars. Okay. In our first example, we have absolute value of x equals 5. This is an absolute value equation. X is inside the brackets. Okay. So this is what you should say to yourself when you see these types of problems. The absolute value of what numbers are equal to 5? Okay. Notice that S is bold. Or which numbers are 5 units away from 0? Okay. The S is bold to emphasize that typically absolute value equations have two solutions. This is because there are two numbers that are 5 units away from 0. Okay. Negative 5 and 5. 5 is the obvious one, but in the other direction, negative 5 is also 5 units away from 0. Okay. However, expressions inside the absolute value bars are typically a little bit more complicated than that. So, here's our next example. We have the absolute value of 3x equals 18. We know that the two numbers 18 units away from 0 are negative 18 and 18. And so we need to find out what x values will get the expression inside the absolute value bars to equal those numbers. And so to do that, we write two equations. Here we say, okay, inside this this bracket could be negative 18 or positive 18. Those are the two numbers that are 18 units away from 0. And then we solve the expression, the equation. Okay, so we'll work on solving that equation. Divide by 3, we'll get x equals negative 6. Divide by 3, we get x equals positive 6. Okay. In our next example, we have the absolute value of x minus 4 equals 7. So again, we think inside, what are 7 units away from 0? Okay, x minus 4 could equal negative 7 or positive 7. And so then we have two equations to solve. X minus 4 equals negative 7. X minus 4 equals positive 7. Solve both of those. I'll add 4 to both sides. Get x equals negative 3. Add 4 to both sides. X equals positive 11. So negative 3, positive 11 are our two numbers. Okay, our two solutions. Moving on to the back. Look at our next equation. We say 2 times the absolute value of x plus 7 equals 18. So notice that this has a number outside the absolute value bars. Okay, and before we write our two equations, we need to isolate the absolute value expression. Okay, and what that means in this case, isolate. What that means in this case, we need to divide both sides by 2. Okay, that 2 right outside the absolute value bar means it's multiplying. To get rid of it, we divide. We do not distribute the 2. Do not distribute inside absolute value brackets. Okay, so now, as we divide both sides by 2, divide by 2, divide by 2, we get the absolute value of x plus 9, x plus 7 equals 9. Okay, now that the absolute value expression is isolated, There are no numbers outside the bars. We can write our two equations. Our first equation, we can say, okay, x plus 7 could equal negative 9, or x plus 7 could equal positive 9. And we solve both of those. So x plus 7 equals negative 9. Subtract 7 from both sides. X would equal negative 16. X plus 7 equals 9. Subtract 7 from both sides. X would equal 2. So our two solutions are negative 16 and positive 2. Okay. All right, some more practice here. It says solve each absolute value equation. So just as we talked about, before we start splitting the problem, we need to make sure that we get the absolute value bars by itself. So I'm going to treat this like a big variable and move everything away from an absolute value of 2x minus 5. So the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 1 from both sides. I'll get 4 times the absolute value of 2x minus 5 equals 12. Then I'll divide by 4, and I'll get the absolute value of 2x minus 5 equals 3. So I took those steps to get the absolute value bars by themselves. And now from there, I'm going to split this into two problems. So we always have to wait until we get our absolute value bars by itself. But now I'm going to split this into two problems. 2x minus 5 can equal 3 or negative 3. And now I solve for both. Okay, add 5 to both sides in here. We have 2x equals 2. Divide by 2, x equals 1. Add 5 to both sides. 2x equals 8. X equals 4. And so here are our two solutions. X equals 1 and 4. Okay, and we can try the same thing over here. And actually, it would be good for you to pause and try it on your own. And then watch me do it, I guess. Check if you're interested. So here first, same thing, we want to make sure that we get the absolute value bracket by itself before we split the problem. So I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides here. And I'll be left with negative 3 times the absolute value of 1 minus x equals negative 6. And then I need to divide by negative 3 on both sides. And I'll get 1 minus x equals 2. Okay, so we have the absolute value of 1 minus x equals 2, and then we split our problem. 1 minus x could equal negative 2, 1 minus x could equal positive 2. And we just solve for both of them. Subtract 1 on each side, negative x equals negative 3, and so divide by negative 1, x equals 3. Here, subtract 1 on each side, negative x equals 1, divide by negative 1, x equals negative 1. And so our two solutions, x equals negative 1 and 3. Alright, so really the whole goal is to get the absolute value by itself and then solve for the positive and the negative possibility. Alright, so here's a special case. When you isolate the absolute value expression here in this problem. So let's do that. We have 13 plus 2 times the absolute value of x plus 8 equals 5. So as we try to solve this, we'll subtract 13 from both sides. And then I'll get 2 times the absolute value of x plus 8 equals negative 8. And then I divide by 2. I get x plus 8 equals negative 4. Okay, when we isolate the absolute value expression, you get a negative number. Or absolute value of x plus 8 equals negative 4. Let's just say that. Many people will just automatically move on to making two equations, but think back to what I had you say at the beginning. Which numbers are, and in this case you'll say, negative 4 units away from 0. If you think about this situation is impossible. Okay, we said you can't be negative distance away from anything. Okay, you could be 4 units away from 0, but You could be 4 units away from 0, but you can't be negative 4 units away from 0. Okay, therefore, this equation has no solutions. Be careful, though, with this, because just because you have a negative number at the beginning here doesn't mean that necessarily it will be no solution. Make sure that you divide your numbers first. In this case, we had plus 2 times the absolute value of x plus 8. But in a situation where we had minus 2 times the absolute value of x plus 8, we would still be able to, we would want to get our thing all the way by itself, the absolute value brackets all the way by itself before we decided whether there was solutions or not. Okay, so if this were negative, and that's why it's important, guys, not to just throw away that negative when you get rid of the number in front of it, okay? So make sure you pay extra attention to those signs, but in this case it comes out to be a negative number. So before you say no solutions, you must isolate the absolute value bracket. Okay. Last example here, we have 6 minus the absolute value of 3 plus n equals negative 1. Okay, it's a tricky one because just because of getting the bracket by itself. So in this example, we should subtract 6 first on both sides. When we do that, we're left with negative absolute value of 3 plus n equals negative 7. And then from there, notice that we have a negative out here, so really you can think of it as negative 1. In order to get rid of it all the way, we'll divide by negative 1, okay, and that'll give us the absolute value of 3 plus n equals 7. Absolute value of 3 plus n equals 7. Okay, and so now our absolute value equals a positive number. We can think, what's 7 away from 0? Well, there's two numbers that are 7 away from 0, 7 and negative 7. And so 3 plus n could equal 7, 3 plus n could equal negative 7. And then we solve. Subtract the n from, subtract 3 from both sides. And so we'll get n equals 4. Subtract 3 from both sides. N equals negative 10. And our solution, n equals negative 10 and 4. Okay. All right, so that's solving absolute value equations. Make sure that you pay attention to getting the absolute value bars isolated before you split the problem, and then make sure to pay attention to split the problem and to solve for both the positive and the negative distance, or not distance, positive and negative numbers that are going to be the distance from 0. See you guys.